Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be my 2020 reading statistics video. I'm going to go through a few things that Goodreads pulls automatically. Also, I uploaded my Goodreads files to Storygraph, so I'm going to go through their stuff, as well as a few numbers of my own. According to Goodreads, I read 195 books this year. Interestingly, there are about 10 items that were trackable on Goodreads that aren't trackable on Storygraph, so the total number is slightly different. There are some individual short stories and independently published things that aren't on Storygraph, so they didn't transfer over. So that's a little interesting for people who are considering moving over to Storygraph. According to Goodreads, the most commonly read book that I read this year was Jon Krakauer's Into the Wild. That was made into a movie and I think was pretty popular, so that makes sense. The least read thing that I read this year was Patrice Jones's Gravy, which is a collection of poetry. Patrice Jones is a regular commenter here on BookTube. She doesn't make videos herself, but she does put out her reviews on Instagram, and she's a regular BookTube commenter, so check out her book. It's a lot of fun. According to Goodreads, my average star rating this year was 3.7, which is pretty reasonable. I generally default to 3 stars and then books either gain or lose. So 3 is not a negative rating for me. I know it is for some people, but that is overall pretty positive. This was not a year in which I had a lot of outstanding reads, though, to be honest, but I think some of that is just the general weirdness of 2020. Storygraph gives some more specific things. They said, on average, more than 3/4 of the books that I read were under 300 pages, and the remaining quarter within itself primarily 300 to 500 pages, and then a small sliver of 500 plus. Which makes sense because my percentage of both comics and poetry this year I think was higher than it normally would be. Over on Storygraph, I get a nice pie chart of my fiction to nonfiction breakdown, and it shows about 2/3 nonfiction to 1/3 fiction, which I'm sure comes as a surprise to no one who watches my stuff regularly. Next up, we'll look at some stats that I pulled myself. In terms of format, 48% of the books that I read this year were in ebook format, 40% were physical books, and 12% were audiobooks. The physical to ebook ratio, I would say, is probably reversed from what my reading is normally like, but that is probably 100% because of the fact that libraries were closed for so much of the spring and summer, and because most of the books that I read come from the library, that had a huge impact that you could only access ebooks for a while. Also along those lines, only 76% of the books that I read this year were from the library. I know for some people that would still be a huge percentage, and it is obviously still the overwhelming majority of the books that I read, but I'm usually between 85 and 95% library books, so 76% library books is actually quite low for me. And I did buy quite a few more books this year than I normally do, so actually one of my goals for 2021 is going to be to make sure that I actually get through all of the books that I bought, because while I did read some of them, I do have a bit more of a backlog of new unread books that I normally wouldn't have had. So yeah, 19% of the books that I read in 2020 were books that I owned, which, as I said, is quite high. 3% were from NetGalley, 1% were from Amazon Prime's lending library service, 1% or 2 books were books that I borrowed from my mother. And unlike most years, where usually it's 2 mysteries that I borrowed from her, this I think was 1 mystery and also the autobiography of Malcolm X, because I borrowed that from her too. In terms of the type of writing, 37% of the books that I read this year were long-form prose, 13% were short form, so short stories or essays, 12% were poetry, 33% were comics, and just under 5% were photo or mixed media type books. My poetry percentage is usually slightly under 10%, it's usually around 8%, and my comics percentage is usually around 1/4. So 1/3 comics and 12% poetry are both significantly larger than they would normally be, and I think both of those things are that from between, I would say, March and July, I was reading quite heavily of both poetry and comics, in part because that's very accessible on the library app Hoopla, and I think also in part just because things were weird and poetry and comics are, I was almost going to say comforting, but the kind of material that I read is usually not comforting, so that's probably not the right way to describe it. In terms of the years in which the books were written, nearly 19% of the books that I read in 2020 were published in 2020, which is interesting. And beyond that, a full 85% of the books that I read were published in the 21st century, which is quite a large percentage. I don't necessarily know that I want to increase or decrease, although I am having an interesting time reading some older material. But by comparison, 17 of the books that I read were published in the 20th century, 4 were published in the 19th century, one in the 18th century, one in the 16th century, one in the 13th century, one in the 9th century, and one in the 7th century. So that's kind of interesting. And I do feel like reading some 9th and 10th century stuff has made me want to read more of that, because there is a lot of really interesting material that was written in those days. I feel like publication date is not the best way to describe things that are that old, because obviously publication didn't exist as a thing that long ago. But the time when it was written, I suppose, is a better description of that. Since everything that came from before the 19th century was something in translation, that segues us nicely into the language in which the material was written. This year, a quarter of the books that I read were written in languages other than English, and of that quarter, 55% were in French. That is pretty normal. 8% were originally written in German. That is probably slightly higher than it normally would be, just because I did have in my mind that the Read German Books 2020 challenge that Britta and Melanie were doing was in my mind, so I did pick up a couple of things that I might not have otherwise. 7% of the books that I read were originally published in Russian, Turkish, and Spanish. I also read 2 books each from Japanese, Chinese, and Arabic, and 1 each from Italian, Icelandic, Portuguese, and Albanian. Again, that's not necessarily something that I'm looking to particularly change, but I am semi-following along with the Invisible Cities project for 2021, which I'll link to everybody who's involved in that below. That is a project in which there are 3 countries per month, and the goal is to read at least 1 book, watch at least 1 film, and cook at least 1 dish from each of those countries each month. And so the 3 countries for January are Argentina, Japan, and Morocco, and both February and March have been announced as well, so you can check all of that out. I don't know that I'm going to be following along absolutely, but I think following along with it even peripherally will lend itself to some of this, although given global publishing, maybe not. I think it'll still be highly English and French, but we'll see. I don't track whether I read the books in translation or in the original language, because I don't necessarily think that's as useful as it could be. Because, for example, I have a couple of the graphic novels that I bought this year. This is a biography of James Brown, and this was originally published in French, but I bought the English translation because it is literally half the price. And these are hardcovers, so that is a significant difference. And on the flip side, The Old Guard, this was originally written in English, and I bought the French edition because I wanted it in hardcover, because I'm buying this mostly for the art. So price or format has an impact for me in a way that I think makes whether something is in translation or not super useful. And since this leads us into demographics, next up, so let's talk about gender next. First of all, my gender breakdown discounts about 10 to 15% of the books that I read, just because if they are an essay collection with multiple authors, or if it is a comic format book with a different author and illustrator, and the people aren't of the same gender, then I just don't bother counting those. So that is 10 to 15% of my reading that has multiple authors that doesn't get counted for this. But when I work out the numbers for the rest of it, it was 42% men, 40% women, and 4% non-binary, or just outside of male and female, insofar as I could tell. There was also one piece that I read that was a traditional Icelandic poem, and that doesn't technically have an author, so that's not counted either. And I think when we do talk about books that were published prior to 50 years ago, and especially prior to 200 years ago, I don't think a lot of the gender labels are super useful, because you never know. I think even looking at the non-binary number, so there were 6 authors on that list that identified as non-binary, and 2 of them announced that after I had read the book, but before the end of the year. So I think that's something that can always be in flux. I don't track whether authors are trans if they identify within the binary, because I think that is something that that gets into fishy territory, and I don't think that's great to do. While we're talking about iffy territory, I also don't track 2 of the categories that I know some people track, one of which is sexuality. I just don't think it's appropriate. Now, looking at the genre breakdown that I get on Storygraph, it does say LGBTQ is my 3rd most commonly read genre, after biography and graphic novel. Now, I wouldn't consider queer themed to be a genre. I wouldn't consider graphic novel to be a genre, but that it's 3rd in my list does make me feel that I'm not missing anything, so I don't really feel like that's something I need to be tracking. And I also definitely do not track authors' religion, because I feel like the judgment that you have to make to decide whether somebody is observant enough to check that box, very inappropriate. Incidentally, I also don't track disability, because that's specifically something I seek out, so I don't worry about whether I'm reading enough disabled authors, because I assume I'm looking for them. And before anyone complains that I'm using identity language rather than person-first language, yeah, I tend not to read people who use person-first language, because I find that objectionable. So I had somebody comment on a video once. Yeah, we won't get into that. I do find geography to be useful to track. And once you start tracking geography, it is certainly possible to pull ethnicity out of that. At a really high level, I don't think it's super useful, but I know people are interested in this kind of thing. If I were using the kind of US framework for race, which again I don't think is useful if you're reading more globally, but for the sake of argument, about a third of my reading is from authors that would, in a US context, be defined as white. From that, you would guess that that would mean 2/3 would be people of color, but the issue with that is that there is a whole stretch of the world in which those are not useful labels, namely Northwest Asia and Latin American countries. So I would call 10 to 20% of that to be, it's complicated. What's really funny is you can even Google white people, and if you look on the Wikipedia page, there's a whole swath of green that is Georgia, Turkey, Armenia, and Azerbaijan that says under debate, which even geographically, that is also true. If you watched people doing videos about the Booker International Awards this past year, a lot of people were of differing opinions as to how many authors were European versus Asian, because there's debate over whether Georgia is in Europe or Asia. If you look at the Nobel Prize for Literature, people debate about the number of European versus Asian winners, because nobody can agree on whether Turkey is in Europe or Asia. So, again, not useful. If we were going to break that down a little bit more, we would say a third were people of European heritage, a third were Asian, around 16% were sub-Saharan African, around 2% North African, around 7% Indigenous, around 3% Latin American. Now within each of those groups, the statistics that I'm more interested in sit. I was looking at my numbers last year and thought I don't read nearly enough authors from Northeastern Europe or from Central Asia, or the former Soviet Union, other than the countries in the South Caucasus, in other words. And so that is something I was trying to increase this year. Now the thing that I came up against with some of that is, especially when it comes to countries in Central Asia, it is sometimes very hard to find books that have been translated into either English or French. So that is an ongoing challenge. To close this out, let's talk about genre. As I said, Storygraph gives a genre list, but as I mentioned, a lot of the genres that they list in there don't strike me as being actual genres. They did say biography was my number one. I would actually say that a lot of those were actually memoirs, which I think are kind of different than biography, but I understand why that's conflated. I'm going to use my own numbers instead of Storygraphs for this, because I didn't love the way they worked. So within fiction, my number one genre was science fiction and fantasy with 35%. Tied for number two were literary fiction and mystery or crime at 19%. And then there were a handful of sports, classics, autofiction, which I don't love putting in fiction because in some cases that's a memoir, but whatever. Oh, there was almost 8% romance, which surprised me because I don't feel like I read that much romance this year. And then in nonfiction, my highest percentage with 27% was memoir, 16% with sociology, 12% history, and then a smattering of environmental, finance, medical, cultural analysis, sport, humor, music, journalism, etc. I feel like I was heavy on the memoirs this year just because so many memoirs were being recommended in the late spring and early summer. And actually that's something I forgot to mention when I was doing the demographic breakdown, in that I felt like I was reading far too many memoirs from American, or US-based at least, authors. So that's something I'm going to try to get at least somewhat away from next year, to maybe avoid memoirs if they are written by people who were at least raised in the United States and educated there. Because there was one point where I was reading a memoir, and I'm not even going to mention which one because it is a very good one that most people love, but I hit the middle of this where the person was describing their university experience, and I just went, I do not care about this, and I've heard too many stories about people's fraternity experiences. I never want to read another one of these again. Now that's maybe a bit extreme, but I do think I need a break from that kind of thing. So if I read another memoir by somebody who's based in the US, they better have immigrated there after the age of 22. That's all I can say. I don't know. That is a very specific goal. In any case, those I think were all of the statistics that I pulled. If there's something I didn't pull that you think I should have, let me know and maybe I'll look into that for next year. If you've made a statistics video and I haven't commented on it, let me know because I love watching statistics videos and I will enjoy watching it. In any case, that's it for now. Ciao.